Good day, friends, and welcome back to Conflicts of the Human Race. Today, I will tell you about the entire story of the War of the Spanish Succession, 1714. Now buckle up as we begin. In the autumn of 1700, Europe held its breath as the sickly Spanish King Charles II lay dying in Madrid's royal palace. The last Habsburg ruler of Spain had no direct heir, leaving the fate of a vast global empire hanging in the balance. His dominions stretched from the Netherlands to Naples, from the Americas to the Philippines, controlling immense wealth and strategic territories. European powers watched nervously as two primary claimants emerged: Philip of Anjou, grandson of France's mighty son, King Louis XIV, and Archduke Charles of Austria. The dying king's decision would determine whether French power would dominate Europe or if the delicate balance would be maintained. As Charles II drew his final breaths, the continent unknowingly stood on the precipice of one of the most devastating and transformative conflicts in European history. On November 1, 1700, Charles II died, and his will stunned Europe. Against all expectations, he had named Philip of Anjou as his sole heir, choosing to keep the Spanish Empire intact under French Bourbon rule rather than see it partitioned. Louis XIV faced a momentous decision at Versailles. He had previously agreed to partition treaties that would divide Spanish territories, but now his grandson could inherit everything. After consulting his council, the son king made his fateful choice. On November 16, 1700, he presented Philip to the French court with the legendary words, "Gentlemen, here is the King of Spain." The implications were staggering. A Bourbon Spain allied with Bourbon France would create a superpower controlling both sides of the Pyrenees, threatening to upset the European balance that had existed since the Peace of Westphalia. England, Austria, and the Dutch Republic watched in horror as their worst nightmare materialized. The prospect of French hegemony over Europe and its trade routes prompted immediate diplomatic protests, but Louis XIV seemed unconcerned by foreign objections to his grandson's legitimate inheritance. By 1701, Louis XIV's subsequent actions confirmed Europe's worst fears about French ambitions. He moved French troops into Spanish Netherlands fortresses, expelled Dutch garrison forces from barrier towns, and most provocatively, granted French merchants exclusive trading rights to Spanish America, breaking long-standing commercial agreements. When the exiled James II died in France, Louis recognized his son James Francis Edward Stuart as the rightful King of England, directly challenging William III's legitimacy. This recognition of the old pretender was seen as an act of war by the English Parliament. The Holy Roman Emperor Leopold I, already furious about losing Spanish territories he considered rightfully Austrian, began mobilizing his forces. The Dutch, facing economic ruin from French trade monopolies and military occupation of their barrier fortresses, prepared for another devastating conflict. English merchant interests, threatened by exclusion from lucrative Spanish colonial markets, pressured William III for military action. By spring 1701, the diplomatic situation had deteriorated beyond repair. The Grand Alliance began to coalesce as Europe's Protestant and Habsburg powers united against what they perceived as intolerable French aggression and the threat of Catholic hegemony. The Grand Alliance was formally signed on September 7, 1701, in The Hague, uniting England, the Dutch Republic, and Austria in a sacred covenant against French expansion. The alliance's stated goals were to prevent the union of French and Spanish crowns, restore Dutch barrier fortresses, secure English succession under William III, and ensure Austrian claims to Spanish territories in Italy and the Netherlands. Leopold I committed the full might of the Holy Roman Empire, while William III pledged English naval power and subsidies. The Dutch, despite their recent exhaustion from the 9 Years' War, courageously committed their remaining resources to preserve their commercial survival and Protestant faith. Shortly after, Savoy, Portugal, and various German states joined the coalition, creating a formidable alliance stretching from the North Sea to the Mediterranean. However, the Allies faced a daunting challenge. France remained Europe's most powerful military force, boasting the continent's largest standing army under experienced marshals like Villas and Vendôme. Spain's global resources, though declining, still provided immense wealth and strategic bases. The stage was set for a titanic struggle that would determine whether Europe would bow to French hegemony or maintain the delicate balance of power through collective resistance. The war officially began on May 15, 1702, when the Grand Alliance declared war on France and Spain. Initial campaigns focused on multiple theaters as both sides sought decisive advantages. In the Spanish Netherlands, the Duke of Marlborough assumed command of Allied forces, beginning his legendary military career. His opponent, Marshal Boufflers, commanded experienced French veterans defending a network of powerful fortresses. Along the Rhine, imperial forces under Prince Louis of Baden faced Marshal Villas in a series of tactical engagements that would determine control of German territories. The Italian theater erupted as Austrian forces invaded Spanish Lombardy, while French troops moved to support their new Spanish allies. At sea, the Royal Navy immediately imposed a blockade of French ports, while Anglo-Dutch fleets moved to intercept Spanish treasure fleets carrying American silver that financed the Bourbon War effort. The conflict's global nature became apparent as fighting spread to North America, where it was known as Queen Anne's War, and to the Caribbean, where Sugar Islands changed hands repeatedly. Early battles proved inconclusive, but both sides recognized this would be no brief conflict. The fate of European civilization hung in the balance as armies mobilized across the continent. The year 1703 brought mixed fortunes for both sides, but demonstrated the war's expanding scope and complexity. Marlborough captured several key fortresses in the Spanish Netherlands, including Bonn and Haye, showcasing the tactical brilliance that would make him legendary. However, French forces under Marshal Villas achieved significant victories in Germany, defeating imperial armies at Friedlingen and threatening to knock Bavaria's Elector Maximilian Emmanuel firmly into the French camp. The Bavarian alliance with France opened a dangerous second front against Austria, forcing Leopold I to divide his forces between Italian and German theaters. In Spain, the Archduke Charles landed in Lisbon with Allied support, establishing an alternative court and beginning a brutal civil war that would tear the Iberian Peninsula apart for over a decade. Portuguese entry into the Grand Alliance provided crucial Atlantic bases and opened a new front against Philip VS forces. The Hungarian Kurak rebellion, led by Francis Rákóczi and supported by French gold and weapons, further diverted Austrian resources from the main conflict. At sea, English naval victories at Vigo Bay destroyed a Spanish treasure fleet, depriving the Bourbon powers of desperately needed American silver while filling English coffers with captured wealth that helped finance continued Allied operations across multiple continents. The crisis year of 1704 opened with French forces threatening to deliver a knockout blow to the Habsburg heartland. Marshal Tallard and Elector Max Emanuel of Bavaria had joined forces, creating a powerful army that menaced Vienna itself. The situation appeared desperate for the Grand Alliance as French victories multiplied across multiple theaters. However, Marlborough conceived a daring strategic masterstroke that would transform the war's trajectory. Against conventional wisdom and explicit Dutch opposition, he proposed marching his army from the Netherlands deep into southern Germany to confront the Franco-Bavarian threat directly. This audacious plan required perfect coordination with Prince Eugene of Savoy's imperial forces and risked leaving the Spanish Netherlands vulnerable to French counterattacks. The march itself covered over 250 miles through hostile territory, requiring precise logistics and unwavering discipline. Marlborough's army moved with unprecedented speed and efficiency, reaching the Danube before French commanders realized the full scope of his intentions. Meanwhile, Prince Eugene demonstrated his own tactical genius by containing French forces in Italy and rushing north to coordinate with his new English ally. The convergence of these two military giants would prove decisive in determining whether the Habsburg dynasty would survive this existential threat to their centuries-old dominance in Central Europe. On August 13, 1704. The combined armies of Marlborough and Prince Eugene faced the Franco-Bavarian forces at the village of Blenheim on the Danube. Marshal Tallard commanded approximately 56,000 French and Bavarian troops in a strong defensive position, while the Allies fielded about 52,000 English, Dutch, Austrian, and German soldiers. The battle began at dawn, with Prince Eugene's wing attacking the Bavarian positions on the French left, drawing enemy reserves away from the center. Marlborough personally led the main assault across the marshy ground toward Blenheim village, where French infantry had fortified houses and created strong defensive positions. The fighting was savage and desperate, with both sides sustaining horrific casualties as musket volleys and cavalry charges determined the fate of Europe. At the crucial moment, Marlborough executed a brilliant tactical maneuver, feinting toward the village while his main force struck the weakened French center. The French line collapsed under this coordinated assault, and Marshal Tallard himself was captured along with thousands of his men. The Franco-Bavarian army disintegrated, with survivors fleeing toward the Rhine in complete disorder. This stunning Allied victory saved Vienna, eliminated the immediate threat to Austria, and established Marlborough's reputation as one of history's greatest military commanders. The victory at Blenheim transformed the strategic situation across Europe and shattered the myth of French invincibility that had dominated European warfare for decades. News of Tallard's defeat and capture sent shockwaves through Versailles, where Louis XIV realized for the first time that this war might not end in easy French victory. Bavaria was effectively knocked out of the conflict as Elector Max Emmanuel fled into French exile, leaving his devastated territories under Austrian occupation. The threat to Vienna evaporated as French forces retreated beyond the Rhine, allowing Habsburg armies to redeploy to other critical theaters. Marlborough's victory secured his political position in England and earned him unprecedented rewards, including the grant of Blenheim Palace from a grateful Queen Anne. However, the war was far from over. French resilience and the vast resources of their Spanish alliance ensured continued resistance across multiple fronts. In Spain, the Archduke Charles struggled to establish his authority outside Portuguese-controlled territories, while Philip VS forces maintained control of most major cities. The Italian theater remained deadlocked as Austrian and French armies maneuvered for advantage in Lombardy and Piedmont. At sea, the naval war intensified as both sides sought to interdict enemy commerce and secure crucial supply lines to distant theaters of operation. The years 1706 witnessed the war's expansion into a truly global conflict as fighting erupted from North America to the Mediterranean. In Catalonia, the Archduke Charles landed at Barcelona with Allied naval support, sparking a fierce Catalan revolt against Philip VS centralizing policies. The Catalans embraced Charles as their legitimate king, providing him with a crucial Spanish base and demonstrating that Philip's support was far from universal. French Marshal Tessay's siege of Barcelona failed catastrophically, dealing another blow to Bourbon prestige. Meanwhile, Marlborough continued his string of victories in the Spanish Netherlands, capturing numerous fortresses through brilliant siegecraft and tactical innovation. The Battle of Ramillies on May 23, 1706, became another masterpiece of Marlborough's military genius as he destroyed a French army under Marshal Villeroy, opening the road to Brussels. Prince Eugene simultaneously achieved remarkable success in Italy, driving French forces from most of Lombardy and threatening to invade southern France through the Alpine passes. The Royal Navy's capture of Gibraltar in 1704 and subsequent successful defense against Franco-Spanish counterattacks provided England with a permanent Mediterranean base. These accumulated victories convinced many observers that the Grand Alliance was winning decisively. But Louis XIV's determination and French military resilience would soon demonstrate that reports of Bourbon defeat were premature. The year 1707 marked a critical turning point as both sides recognized the war's enormous costs and began seeking decisive victories to force peace negotiations. In Spain, Allied forces captured Madrid briefly, allowing Archduke Charles to be proclaimed King Charles III. But their occupation proved temporary as they lacked sufficient popular support. The Battle of Almanza on April 25, 1707, saw French Marshal Berwick, ironically an illegitimate son of the deposed James II, decisively defeat Allied forces and restore Philip V's control over central Spain. This victory effectively ended Allied hopes of easily installing Charles III on the Spanish throne and demonstrated that the Spanish succession would require continued military resolution. In the north, Marlborough's attempted siege of Toulon, coordinated with Prince Eugene and the Royal Navy, failed despite enormous expenditure of resources, showing that France retained formidable defensive capabilities even under severe pressure. The campaign highlighted the challenges of coalition warfare as Austrian, English, and Dutch priorities increasingly diverged. French privateers intensified their attacks on Allied commerce, while the Royal Navy expanded its blockade of French ports, creating severe economic hardship on both sides. Both warring coalitions faced mounting financial strain as the conflict entered its 7th year with no decisive resolution in sight, setting the stage for even more desperate measures and bloodier battles. By 1708, the war had become a grueling test of endurance as both sides struggled with mounting casualties, economic exhaustion, and war weariness among their populations. Louis XIV's France faced particular difficulties as harsh winters, crop failures, and economic blockade created widespread suffering among the common people. The famous winter of 1708–1709 became legendary for its severity, with temperatures so low that wine froze in bottles and rivers became solid ice highways. French agriculture collapsed as seeds froze in the ground, creating famine conditions that threatened the monarchy's stability. Desperate peasants rioted in Paris and provincial cities, forcing Louis XIV to consider peace negotiations for the first time since the war began. However, Allied demands proved so harsh that the Sun King chose to continue fighting rather than accept what he considered humiliating surrender terms. The Grand Alliance insisted on French assistance in removing Philip V from the Spanish throne, a condition that Louis XIV famously rejected, declaring he would rather fight his enemies than his grandson. Prince Eugene's victory at the Battle of Oudenarde demonstrated continued Allied tactical superiority, but French armies remained intact and capable of resistance. The Siege of Lille became a grinding test of wills as both sides poured resources into what contemporaries called the graveyard of Europe. The Battle of Malplaquet on September 11, 1709, became the bloodiest engagement of the entire war, a Pyrrhic Allied victory that demonstrated the true cost of European power politics. Marshal Villars had positioned approximately 75,000 French troops in heavily fortified positions near the Belgian border, determined to halt Marlborough and Prince Eugene's advance toward Paris. The Allied commanders, commanding roughly 110,000 troops from multiple nations, decided to assault these positions despite their obvious strength, believing that one more decisive victory would end French resistance permanently. The battle raged for over 12 hours in unprecedented savagery as Allied infantry repeatedly charged French entrenchments, suffering horrific casualties from concentrated musket fire and artillery bombardment. Dutch and English regiments were virtually annihilated in frontal assaults that gained mere yards of blood-soaked ground. Prince Eugene himself was wounded while leading his men forward, and even Marlborough's tactical genius could not prevent enormous losses among his veteran formations, though the French eventually retreated, leaving the field technically to the Allies. Both armies were so devastated that effective military operations became impossible for months. The battle's aftermath shocked European public opinion and intensified calls for peace negotiations. Malplaquet proved that military victory alone could not resolve the fundamental political issues underlying this devastating conflict. The period from 1710 to 1711 witnessed dramatic political changes that fundamentally altered the war's trajectory and ultimate resolution. In Britain, The Whig government that had prosecuted the war so vigorously fell from power, replaced by Tories who favoured peace negotiations and questioned the enormous costs of continued fighting. Queen Anne's favour shifted toward new ministers like Robert Harley and Henry St. John, who secretly began negotiations with French representatives. The death of Archduke Charles's elder brother made him heir to the Austrian throne as future Emperor Charles VI, ironically recreating the same imperial combination that the Grand Alliance had fought to prevent under French auspices. Allied unity crumbled as national interests diverged, and war exhaustion mounted among all participants. Louis XIV skillfully exploited these divisions, offering separate peace terms to different alliance members and gradually detaching them from the coalition. In Spain, Philip VS forces gradually regained control of most territories, demonstrating the futility of imposing an unwanted monarch on a resistant population. The economic costs of the conflict had become unsustainable for all participants as trade disruption, military expenditure, and agricultural devastation created widespread hardship. Secret diplomacy increasingly replaced military action as the primary means of resolving the succession question through negotiated compromise rather than total victory. The final military phase of the war from 1711 to 1712 was characterized by diminishing Allied coordination and French resurgence under Marshal Villa's inspired leadership. Marlborough, despite his unmatched military genius, found his political support eroding in London as Tory ministers actively undermined his campaigns through reduced funding and conflicting orders. His final victory at Bauchin demonstrated tactical brilliance but achieved no strategic purpose as his government had already committed to peace. Prince Eugene continued Austrian resistance alone, but without English subsidies and Dutch support, his resources proved inadequate for decisive offensive operations. Marshal Villars exploited Allied disunity brilliantly, winning the Battle of Denain and recapturing several key fortresses that restored French prestige after years of humiliating defeats. In Spain, Philip VS' position solidified as he gained genuine popular support and married Elizabeth Farnese, securing Italian backing for his dynasty. The war in North America continued sporadically as frontier settlements endured raids and counter-raids, but European powers increasingly focused on diplomatic rather than military solutions. French negotiators, led by the skillful Marquis de Torcy, successfully separated British and Austrian interests while offering attractive commercial concessions that appealed to English merchant classes eager to end the ruinous conflict and restore profitable trade relationships. The Congress of Utrecht formally convened in 1712, bringing together representatives from all major European powers to negotiate a comprehensive peace settlement. The complex negotiations reflected the war's multinational character and the diverse interests of participants who had fought together, but now pursued separate national objectives. Britain's primary concerns centered on trade concessions, colonial acquisitions, and ensuring the Protestant succession, while Austria desperately sought compensation for Spanish territories lost to French influence. France, despite recent military improvements, faced economic collapse and internal unrest that made peace essential for Louis XIV's domestic stability. The Spanish succession itself remained contentious as Philip V refused to renounce his throne despite Allied pressure and Austrian claims. Dutch representatives focused on restoring their barrier fortresses and commercial privileges that were essential for their republic's survival as a great power. Smaller states like Savoy and Portugal demanded rewards for their loyal alliance service, while German princes sought confirmation of territorial gains or compensation for wartime losses. The negotiations proved extraordinarily complex as each power attempted to maximize gains while minimizing concessions, creating a diplomatic puzzle that required months of careful bargaining. Secret bilateral agreements proliferated as parties sought advantages outside the main conference structure, undermining theoretical multilateral cooperation and demonstrating the fundamental tensions within the Grand Alliance. The Treaty of Utrecht, signed on April 11, 1713, fundamentally restructured European politics and established a new balance of power that would endure for decades. Britain emerged as the war's primary beneficiary, gaining Gibraltar and Minorca as permanent Mediterranean bases, Newfoundland and Acadia in North America, and the lucrative Asiento contract, granting exclusive rights to supply slaves to Spanish America. France acknowledged the Protestant succession in Britain and expelled the Stuart pretenders, while Louis XIV formally renounced any future union of the French and Spanish crowns. Philip V retained the Spanish throne, but was forced to renounce his claims to the French succession, ensuring that the two kingdoms would remain permanently separate. Austria received the Spanish Netherlands, which became the Austrian Netherlands, along with Milan, Naples, and Sardinia as compensation for losing Spain itself. The Dutch regained their crucial barrier fortresses, but emerged economically exhausted and no longer capable of competing with British commercial expansion. Savoy was elevated to a kingdom and gained Sicily, while Portugal retained its independence and colonial empire. However, Austria initially refused to accept the settlement and continued fighting alone for another year, demonstrating the difficulty of imposing negotiated solutions on reluctant powers. The treaty represented a triumph of pragmatic diplomacy over military conquest, establishing principles of balance and compensation rather than total victory. Austria's continuation of the war until 1714 demonstrated the difficulty of achieving universal peace in such a complex multinational conflict. Emperor Charles VI, still claiming the Spanish throne as Charles III, refused to accept the Utrecht settlement and continued military operations, with Prince Eugene commanding increasingly inadequate forces. The Battle of Barcelona in 1714 marked the final major engagement as Philip V's forces, supported by French troops, besieged the Catalan capital that had remained loyal to the Austrian claimant throughout the war. The heroic defense of Barcelona became legendary in Catalan history, as the city's inhabitants fought desperately against overwhelming odds, knowing that surrender would mean the end of their traditional privileges and autonomy. When the city finally fell on September 11, 1714, it marked not only the end of Austrian hopes in Spain, but also the beginning of centralized Spanish rule that eliminated Catalonia's historic freedoms. The Treaty of Rastatt, signed between Austria and France in March 1714, finally ended the last phase of the conflict by confirming most Utrecht provisions while addressing specific Austrian concerns about Italian territories and imperial boundaries. Prince Eugene's acceptance of these terms marked the end of his legendary military career and Austria's acknowledgement that continued resistance was futile. The Peace of Baden later that year resolved remaining issues between France and the Holy Roman Empire, completing the complex treaty structure that ended this devastating European civil war. The war's conclusion brought mixed results that reflected the complexity of early 18th century European politics and the impossibility of achieving total victory in such a multinational conflict. Britain emerged as the clear winner, having gained valuable territories, trading rights, and naval bases that established the foundation for their later global empire. The Royal Navy's dominance was confirmed, and British merchants gained access to previously closed Spanish colonial markets through the profitable Asiento contract. France, despite retaining Philip V on the Spanish throne, was economically devastated and militarily exhausted, marking the beginning of the end for Louis XIV's dreams of European hegemony. The Sun King's final years were marked by domestic troubles and the enormous debt accumulated during decades of constant warfare. Spain under Philip V began a slow recovery, but remained a secondary power, its Italian territories lost forever to Austrian control. Austria gained substantial compensation through the Spanish Netherlands and Italian possessions, but Emperor Charles VI never abandoned his Spanish claims entirely, ensuring future conflicts over Italian territories. The Dutch Republic's decline accelerated as the enormous costs of the war undermined their commercial supremacy and naval power. The European balance of power was restored through exhaustion rather than decisive victory, creating a precarious stability based on mutual weakness rather than genuine peace between competing dynastic and religious interests. The War of the Spanish Succession's legacy extended far beyond its immediate territorial and dynastic resolutions, fundamentally altering the trajectory of European and global history. The conflict established Britain as the dominant naval and commercial power, setting the stage for their 18th century imperial expansion and eventual global hegemony. The principle of balance of power became permanently embedded in European diplomacy, preventing any single nation from achieving the continental dominance that Louis XIV had sought. The war's enormous financial costs accelerated the development of modern banking, national debt systems, and international commerce that would characterize the emerging modern world economy. Military innovations, particularly in artillery, fortification, and naval warfare, transformed European combat and influenced tactical development for generations. The conflict's global scope, spanning North America, Europe, and the Mediterranean, demonstrated that future European wars would inevitably become world wars involving colonial territories and maritime commerce. The human cost was staggering. Historians estimate over 400,000 military deaths and countless civilian casualties from disease, famine, and economic disruption. Yet from this devastation emerged a new European order based on negotiated settlements rather than dynastic claims, diplomatic compromise rather than military conquest. The war marked the transition from the age of Louis XIV's absolute monarchy to a more complex international system of competing nation-states. If you liked today's story, make sure to check out our other videos on our channel. Have a nice day.